I want to apologise in advance if I ruffle your feathers, but I'm just going to try and throw a few facts at you and see where we land. I've done this a couple of times before with some of our Colson Fellows students this year, and it was an interesting session we had for about an hour discussing Genesis, which is really, really, critical, isn't it? Part of what we believe. So, should worldview thinkers care about Genesis? Well, we should. It's the most recognisable story in all of Western culture. Adam and Eve, man and woman, the serpent is very recognisable symbols, things that people know about. You don't have to be a Christian to know about these things. The two trees, the apple, the forbidden apple, the serpent in the tree, disobedience, running away from God, all these kind of things are right there in the first few chapters, let alone Noah. Everyone knows the story of Noah's Ark, and a lot of people will know about Abraham and the history of the Hebrew people. And it's foundational for our society. A lot of our initial beliefs in Western culture actually spring from Genesis. So we understand that people are fallible, people are sinners and fragile and can fall over. That idea in our culture comes from Genesis. We understand temptation and that people can be tempted into doing wrong. These ideas spring all the way from Genesis in our modern culture. We understand the importance of restraining power and restraining people because they are likely to end in corruption. These ideas come from Genesis. We understand that there's a serpent always waiting in the tree, something ready to take you out, something that's going to offer you a bad way. But we also know the incredible power of heroism. And as it says in Genesis, that one day from Eve will come a child that will crush evil and crush the head of the serpent. We believe in heroes, or the idea of the limping hero, the hero who is bitten on the foot, or Jesus who comes to give us victory by dying on the cross, or Maximus in the movie Gladiator who wins the day by himself being wounded and stabbed and dying. So for us as Christians, Genesis is very important because it's the beginning of our worldview, as Pete mentioned at the start. It's where everything launches from Genesis chapter 1. It's very important for us as Christians because of the story of creation. But there's some problems with Genesis. So Christians claim that Genesis is true. Some make this claim literally. Genesis is literally true. There was a literal 7-day creation. It literally happened about 6,000 years ago. The Bible is inerrant, therefore it's not wrong. So whatever it says verbatim is what we believe. Some Christians wouldn't agree with that, but for them Genesis is true theologically. We believe in the message of Genesis. Now, to the modern skeptic, they would say that Genesis is a fable, because if you apply the scientific method to Genesis, which we tend to do as moderns, we're very scientifically minded, and this has only been the last couple of 100 years we've thought this way as a human race. Before that time, myths and fables and these kind of things were very much how people understood the world. So to a modern, Genesis really is a fable. It's false and it's a myth if you apply the scientific method. So is the first book of the Bible really the truth, or is it actually a myth? There's a myth that goes around our church. Now, this isn't actually me, but this is me in the kitchen here. If you can just imagine, it kind of looks something like that. I tried to find the best picture I could find for what it looks like when I get in the kitchen. So now there's a bit of a myth that goes around our church that Pastor Caleb can't cook. Now, is this myth really true or not? This is the question. Because how many of you have actually been in my kitchen and see me cook or not? Not so many of you. I mean, I have the authority to disclose the truth of the matter because I know and I'm there. Maybe my wife has the authority to tell the story of Caleb, whether he can cook or not. It's a joke that's often used to tease me by people in my own congregation that I can't cook and I can't feed myself, and Zoe has maybe perpetuated this story through complaining of she has to cook 7 nights a week and all these kind of things. It's a joke that's used against me. But technically, it's not really true because I can cook a little bit. I often boil pasta for the kids. I can do Vegemite on toast and all these kind of things. But the reality, no, that's the truth. Technically, the truth is I can cook at some level. I'm not a good cook. But maybe the myth tells a truer story of what's really going on here. And that is, if you look deeper into the story, that is the fact that Pastor Caleb hates cooking. Can I cook? Well, technically I can. Do I like cooking? Do I really want to cook? Can I cook, inverted commas? Not really. Really, the truth of the matter is I hate cooking. I don't like it. And I just like to be looked after. I like to be fed. Let's be honest here. If you get into the deep theological, the true message behind the message is that I just like to be fed. Now, how the heck does this apply to Genesis? Genesis, I want to put to you, is truth through myth. The definition of a myth is a traditional story, especially one concerning the early history of a people or explaining a natural or social phenomenon, and typically involving supernatural beings or events. That's your Oxford definition there. So Genesis, in reality, in truth, is the Jewish origin story that conveys theological truths while evidently comfortable with its own diverse opinions. It's crafted as a theological dialogue, not a scientifically historical account. Now, this is really, really important because it's very hard for us in our modern day to understand this. If someone writes a book and says they authored a book, but they really took the words and took the ideas from someone else, we call that plagiarism. It's very, very serious criminal violation to plagiarize someone else's work. In the ancient world, even in the New Testament world in the first century, it was very common to write and then use another name of a different author, or to attribute a work to someone else, or to take an idea. This was never seen as a bad thing. Go back even further to when the Old Testament or Genesis was written. It was very, very normal to write in the tone of fact and truth, yet really it was a myth or a story conveying an idea. So scientifically, no, Genesis isn't a historical account that we can rectify. And we can't rectify that because no one was there, and there is absolutely zero corroborating evidence for Genesis. The entire 50 chapters of evidence outside of the Bible, there is no other scientific evidence that says this really happened. Archaeological, sacred texts, nothing tells us that it's actually the truth. So you can't say it is a fact in the scientific sense because there's no corroborating evidence. But Genesis was never written to be historically perfect or to be scientifically true. It wasn't written for moderns. Genesis is all about the moral of the story. It's about the theological meaning, not about the literal meaning. You think of the stories we tell our children, the tortoise and the hare, the boy cried wolf. Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. Are these historically true, scientifically measurable stories that really happened in real time, or are they fables and myths? They're myths. You think of Pinocchio. You think of Harry Potter. You think of these stories that we love, Sleeping Beauty, all the Disney stories. Did they really happen? Should we allow our children to watch them if they didn't really happen? Well, we don't watch them because they're accurately, scientifically true or sound. We watch them because a deeper message lies underneath the story. Take Pinocchio, for example. The lessons we learn there are about lying and truth, and that lying is bad. The myth of Pinocchio, if you like, tells us there's a difference between being an orphan and a son, being real, a real boy, or being fake and inauthentic. There's messages that are deeper there about conscience and morality. Remember the little cricket? What's his name? Jiminy, the little cricket, the conscience. Okay, now we know that's not true in how things work, but it's the message that tells us something that's maybe even truer. I want to propose to you that really the truth in Genesis is in the moral of the story. And the myth is often truer than the literal, than the scientific, than the real. There's something that data can't convey. There's something that scientific research articles can't tell us. And when you're dealing with God and humanity and life and origins and the beginning of the universe, it almost makes sense that a myth could convey a truer story about God, about life, about beginnings, about the universe than a factual story could tell us. Let me give you a few little examples here. So one of the common assumptions that Christians often make is that God literally created the earth in 7 days about 6,000 years ago. If I apply the scientific method and look at it from a skeptic's point of view or a non-Christian point of view, well, that can't be true because straight away the Bible already shoots itself in the foot. There's two conflicting versions of creation in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. We've got the Genesis account in 1:1 to 2:4, which they say that that's from the P source or the priestly source. So there's 2 different sources that we get these stories from. And then we've got the second story from the non-priestly source or the lay source, which is in 2:4 to 3:24. Now in the first chapter of Genesis, we hear about a 7-day creation. In the second chapter of Genesis, everything is created in 1 day. The first chapter of Genesis, man is created on the 6th day. In the second chapter of Genesis, the second account of the creation story, man is actually created first, not at the end of a week. Now, once you actually get into the deeper understandings here of where these sources come from, where these stories come from, the priestly source, written by priests, so written by the Jewish scribes, written by men who were believed in the sacred Jewish ways in the Old Testament, they were very ordered. And you think of a pastor, you think of a leader, often very ordered. So they wrote it out in 7 days, creation. They ordered it in 7 days because that made sense for them. But their real motive was what? Their real motive was the 7th day, because on the 7th day, even God rested. Why would a priest be interested in the 7th day? Because his job is to uphold the Sabbath. His job is to uphold the sacredness of the Sabbath. So you can see the motive here of the peace source is to say if God rested on the Sabbath, so us Jewish people must rest and take a day on the Sabbath. The non-priestly source isn't as interested in the technicalities and isn't interested in the order and isn't as interested in the Sabbath. So the story or the account of Genesis comes out differently in that story. In the first account, man is formed by God and breathed into by God. In the second account of Genesis, the man is formed from the earth, like God as a potter, creating him, forming him out of the clay, and then breathing life into him. So you get conflicting stories. Now, what's the deeper truth here? Where's the truer truth in the myth? The deeper one is that Genesis is not actually a decisive book. It's not written to be perfectly ordered or to be totally reconciled. The redactor, which is a fancy word for saying the editor, who took these 2 stories and put them together, was comfortable with Genesis being a dialogue and not a monologue. Again, it can be very difficult for us because in the modern world, we're like, tell us the answer. What's the truth? Where does things end? What focus us on this thing? We like decisiveness. We like the end product. But Genesis wasn't written with that in mind. It was actually written to hold conflicting ideas together in one book. It was actually written that we would be discussing and talking, who is God? What is man? How did things begin in the beginning? At the start of all of creation. It's written as a dialogue, not a monologue telling us exactly what happened. So the meaning in Genesis is actually in the myth. It's in the symbolism. There's actually a theological underpinning, a deeper story going on in Genesis that tells us about God and creation and man and woman and evil and sin and all of these things, which in a lot of ways conveys a truer story about those key things than a literally true story could even tell us. Another common assumption is that Moses authored Genesis during his lifetime, and he probably lived about 1600 to 1800 BC. The truth is that the final edit of Genesis actually probably came down to us in about 550 BC, so only half a millennia from Jesus Christ, and it was written by a Jewish scribe priest, probably a community of them or a group of them in the Persian period, which is the period when they were in exile. And now they were comfortably living among the Persian people in exile and away from Israel. That's the truth, and that's where scholars understand it is at right now. It definitely wasn't written by Moses. Now, the mythical truth, the moral of the story here is that there's a preservation of multiple Israelite ideas of God and nations, or their nation and other nations. That is what's prioritized in the telling of the primordial story, so that's chapters 1 to 11, and the history of the patriarchal family. So that's really why chapters 12 to 50 are written. They're written to tell you the original family, the original Israelite, well, not even tell you, but to tell the Hebrew people about their original family, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the 12 sons. And what comes out of this story, this retelling of the Israelite story, because these Jewish scribe priests, this community, they didn't write it for you and me. They wrote Genesis to capture the history of their own Israelite people in a time where they lived in exile. So you imagine you live in exile and all of your countrymen are spread throughout the whole earth. It would make sense to sit down and actually let's put the history of our people together, because it could be entirely lost here. We don't live in our homeland. We live in slavery. So they went to capture their own understanding of God, the family that started their entire nation, and then what makes the Israelites or the Hebrew people different from the other nations of the earth. That was their motive in writing that. And what comes from it is these powerful motifs of blessing, promise from God, covenant, offspring, children, family, and even stories about land, geographical places, and how God works in relation to land. And these are things for us in modern day, or us as Christians that live today now with Christ on top, that we take great understanding and great confidence from understanding these incredible principles in this fable, if you like, or in this myth that for us is truer than true. Another common assumption is that Genesis 3 captures a catastrophic fall of humankind as they fall into sin and the consequences that now all humans will die. The truth is, and you could read this for yourself, it's there in plain English, Genesis 3 doesn't even mention the word sin. The first mention of sin is actually in Genesis 4 verse 7, where God says to Cain that you've sinned. So the fact that we think that the fall happened in Genesis 3 is interesting when there's sin isn't even mentioned. The promise of immortality is not in the Bible at all. So again, that is something that we read back into the text. An original sin, or that idea of the first sin that ever happened, is actually an Augustinian idea. It's, again, not really there in the text. The mythical truth is that, or the truer truth, is that every person has really committed their own original sin. Is Genesis 3 not really telling us that Adam and Eve screwed it up for all of us? Is Genesis 3 in the deeper meaning actually telling us we will all screw it up for ourselves? And if you were Adam, you would have sinned. And if you were Eve, you would have sinned. Is that the truer truth that sits under the myth? Did Adam and Eve historically, really, literally exist? No one can tell us because there's no corroborating evidence outside of the Bible. But what's truer than Adam and Eve is that we all are infallible. And what's truer is that we will all die. We often read immortality back in because of Paul and what he wrote about in 1 Corinthians 15 when he talks about immortality. But immortality, it's a long stretch to say that it was promised by God to Adam and Eve and they lost it. But it's a much lesser, easier thing to believe that Jesus Christ came, who is immortal, and he gives us the option to be immortal in the future, not that we were immortal in the past. I thought I had one more. That's it. That's good because I'm right on time. What does this mean for us? Understand that you believe that your belief in Genesis is because Jesus believed in Genesis. Don't die on the battlefield of fighting over the literal meaning or the scientific truth of Genesis. Die on the battlefield of Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and he rose from the dead. Allow science to be science and the scientific method to do its job, and value that. That's important. But allow the Bible to be the Bible, and understand why it was written and who it was written for and the style that was written in. It wasn't written for moderns who understand the scientific method. It was written to convey theological truths in a mythical story just like Pinocchio. If the Christian worldview is correct, its message or its story will stand as true in reality, real life, in experience, how you really live, within academic rigor or scientific study, and it will stand as the best explanation of human existence. Despite the questions of Genesis and creation, Jesus is God and rose from the dead. These two facts are the power of the gospel, and they're really the only thing that you need to worry too much about. I've written 3 essays on Genesis, by the way, as well. If you want to have a look at those, they're pretty long, 3,000-word essays. You can go to calebnicholes.com.au.